sense, a biographer about royalty and also those close to it. Shrabani lives in London. She's written a number of books on curry, the story of the nation's favorite dish, about which she spoke yesterday, and more recently, Spy Princess, the life of Noor Hayat Khan. The book that she'll be talking to you about today, though, is her account of a relationship, often misconstrued, between an aging Queen Victoria and her young Muslim Munshi, Abdul Karim. Just to put it in context, in 1884, a young British officer, Frederick Ponsonby, then serving in India, was recalled to become the equerry-in-waiting to Queen Victoria. He was commanded by her before he left to call on Munshi Abdul Karim's father. He did. And when he met the Queen, she asked Ponsonby about the father. Ponsonby told her that the man was not the Surgeon General of India, as she had been led to believe, but in fact, a lowly apothecary in Agra jail. Queen Victoria refused to believe this, and so she insisted to Ponsonby that he must have met the wrong man. But when he persisted, she refused to talk to Ponsonby, even though he was in her court for over a year. Well, who was this Muslim khidmatgar who had such an adhesive hold over the old Queen's affections? To tell us more, I'll begin by asking Shrabani about the personality of the Queen at the time of her first Jubilee in 1887, which is when Abdul Karim entered the court and her life. Please.
Thank you, Aijaz. Thank you for that. Can you hear me at the back? Is it working? Yeah. Thank you for that lovely introduction and sort of build up to this. So I'm going to take you people right back in time. We're going to go to 1887, and it's the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. And she is sent. There are lots of people who want to please the Queen, and one of them is in Agra jail. And he thinks that she would love this present, and she sends him. He sends her 2 Indian servants, 2 Indian men. And they're all wrapped up and dressed grandly. And their only job, one of them is called Abdul Karim, and the other is Muhammad Baksh. And they are sent to her as presents, Jubilee presents, to just stand behind her, look grand, you know, and wait on table. Basically, it's the empire which she wants to depict. So Abdul Karim, this is how he's chosen to go to Queen Victoria. And what I do is I'll give a, he's trained, he's done all, he's just 26 years old, he's 24 years old, he's trained about everything he has to do before he meets the Queen, how to address her, what to do. And one of the things he's been told is that at your first meeting, you must not look at the Queen directly. So here goes. So the Jubilee celebrations have started, and there's a lot of functions going on. You know, entire royalty of the whole world has come there. And the Queen is getting really tired. She is 68 years old at this stage, and she's had lots of celebrations. This is 3 days after her Jubilee. She writes in her journals, "A fine morning with a fresh air," noted the Queen, as she looked out of her bedroom window at Windsor Castle the next day, but she was feeling very tired. It was the 3rd day of her Golden Jubilee celebrations, and the monarch knew she faced another day of buntings and presentations. The Queen sat lost in thought as she was dressed by her maids. She had chosen to wear widow's black ever since the death of Prince Albert in 1861. At last, she adjusted her cap and ascended into her carriage for the short drive to Frogmore with her daughter Beatrice. As they rode down the rolling green of the long walk in Windsor Park, past the rows of chestnut trees, the Queen thought of the excitement of the past 2 days and the fireworks of the night before. Everything now seemed so still. At Frogmore House, her eldest daughter Victoria and her granddaughter Vicky were already there waiting for her, and so was a special gift from India. Abdul Karim and Muhammad Baksh, the Queen's Jubilee presents from India, had arrived early to wait at table. The breakfast room at Frogmore, a somber place at most times, seemed to come alive with the new arrivals. Baksh's practiced elegance matched Karim's naturally regal presence. Their clothes made them look almost princely. The Queen was delighted. Dressed in striking scarlet tunics with white turbans, they approached her reverentially. The Queen noted Muhammad Bakshi's appearance, very dark with a very smiling expression. She described the much younger Abdul Karim as much lighter, tall, and with a fine, serious countenance. Both servants approached her slowly, their eyes lowered to gaze at the ground as they had been instructed to do. Then with a deep bow, Karim and Baksh bent down to kiss the Queen's feet. As he rose, young Karim's dark eyes fleetingly met the Queen's gaze. Suddenly, Victoria no longer felt as tired. So
begins the long romance.
that's the start.
Now, you've mentioned about how the introduction took place and why Abdul Karim and Muhammad Baksh were selected. But what was Karim's background, Abdul Karim's background?
Well, Karim was a very humble clerk from Agra jail. His whole salary was 60 rupees a year, and that's what he was when he came. He was barely he knew Urdu, of course. He barely spoke any English, but he was trained, and he was a quick learner, so he was going to learn very quickly.
Well, as the three Khans in Bollywood have discovered, you can't keep a good Muslim Khan down. And so Karim Baksh managed very quickly to establish himself at court. Shrabani, your book narrates the increasing dependence of Queen Victoria on Abdul Karim, and you've given various examples of how, for example, he begins to wait at her table at breakfast and then at meal times, how he handles her correspondence, the red boxes which she used to process so diligently. All the state papers came to her in locked boxes, and she was often sit late into the night to deal with them. And how he then began, which is what more than many of you have done, to learn Urdu. And he was her tutor. And then, remarkably, he introduced her to curries. So please tell us, how did he manage this?
Well, he was an enterprising Indian. He was going there, and he'd been told, if you please the Queen, you'll go far. So he wasn't going to let that pass. He had carried his little box of spices with him, because as a Muslim, he had to, they had to eat halal meat, so they had to cook their own stuff. They couldn't eat the other meals that the others were eating. So he had his spice box. He'd learned a few meals from his wife. And one day he decides to go into the royal kitchens, and he wants to cook the Queen a curry. And we have it, so he prepares this chicken curry, pulao, rice, korma, whatever he serves her. The Queen, who had a huge appetite, was absolutely delighted. She had never eaten a proper, authentic Indian curry. And so she writes in her journals that she ate this curry, which was excellent. And then she says, as a royal sort of diktat, she says that the curry will be cooked in the royal kitchens every day. And this is something that, none of us know, that for the next 13 years, which is the time she spends with Karim, a curry is cooked in the royal kitchens every day. And we have the menus in which they have, chicken curry and dal. And the dal is spelled D-H-A-L. And her favorites were chicken curry, actually. She loved it. So this was cooked in all the palaces, whether it was Osborne, whether it was Windsor. And she would have these, as time went on and Abdul got promoted and became more than just a servant, she acquired many more Indian servants. So the palace was, they had all these men in turbans running around, and there were these hens because they had to catch their own livestock. So Windsor Castle had hens and chickens sort of running around, and all these Indians, they cornered a portion of the palace. And they would grind the masalas, and these English chefs would look at them and say, there they are grinding it on a stone. They wouldn't use those, curry powders and no instant meals, no takeaways. Proper, authentic stuff would be served. So he had already, the way to, they say man's, but this was a woman's heart, it was the other way. He was winning her with the curry first. And then she also Queen Victoria wanted to learn Urdu. Because she had never been to India. She couldn't travel. She said it was 6 weeks.
I should explain that by this time, she had been declared Empress of India. So it had a special significance.
Exactly. She was Malika-e Hindustan, and she had not been to India. And she wanted not just the picture of India painted by her viceroys, which is all sort of edited stuff. She wanted the real thing. And Abdul Karim, who was now being given double English lessons so that he could really learn English faster. Twice a day he was being tutored so that he could keep up with the Queen. He was the one who was giving her these stories. So he was feeding her the stories from the bazaar, the real stuff, the heat and dust of India, what is the festivals, the festivities, tell her about the Taj Mahal, win her heart with these romantic stories of the Taj. Victoria was a real romantic. She loved these stories. And he would talk about politics, he would talk about Hindu-Muslim riots, everything was fed to her, and she was getting the real picture from this young man. And then, of course, he was teaching her Urdu. So he gave her a phrase book. It's a little red phrase book, which, lies in Windsor Castle. And I couldn't help looking through it, and I'm going to read you some of the very interesting things he was teaching her. So first, in the phrase book, he has standard words like anyone, koi, animal, janwar, anger, khafa, etc. Then there are phrases like, you may go home if you like, tum ghar jao agar chahte ho. The tea is always bad at Osborne. Chai Osborne mein hamesha kharab hai. She had a lot of complaints. The egg is not boiled enough. Anda theek se ubla nahi hai. So you can imagine Queen Victoria saying these. Then there are these intriguing things which she writes. You will miss the Munshi very much. Munshi is Abdul Karim. So you will miss the Munshi very much. Tum Munshi ko bahut yaad karoge. And just remember that the Munshi himself is writing these for her to learn. So that's the background. And the ultimate cherry on the cake is hold me tight. Ab to mazboot na ho. Say no more.
How tightly if Victoria held on to him, you'll be able to learn in the course of the next half hour. So now you know the origins of curries in the United Kingdom, and if you want to blame anybody for the proliferation of curry on every high street in the United Kingdom, it started with the Queen at Windsor and Osborne House. Right. Your book, Shrabani, narrates the increasing dependence I just mentioned, and also, obviously, with the proximity that Abdul Karim enjoyed with Queen Victoria, it was going to earn the hostility of members of the court and also members of her family. So can I deal first with her immediate family, and perhaps you might like to start with her eldest son, Edward, and what was his reaction to the smell of curry throughout the palaces?
Well, Edward, Abdul Karim was hated by everyone, no surprise. I mean, here is this commoner from Agra jail, and suddenly the Queen wants to spend all her time with him. The Queen wants to give him houses. The Queen wants to take him on holiday. The Queen, when Abdul Karim is ill, the Queen packs her bags and goes to his cottage and sits there and props up his pillows and, puts the compress on his... This is the Empress, and everyone in the court is shocked. So how do we know this? I mean, how do I get all this information? It's because of the letters that fly between these courtiers. And they say, oh, she's gone off to Abdul Karim's cottage again. Oh, she, all these sarcastic notes flying between these people. And so the Queen is besotted. One of them writes, she's off her head over the Munshi. Another writes, she's John Brown's, we can see this going, she'd already had this relationship with John Brown. I don't know if some of you may be familiar. There was this, after Albert died, there was a Scottish gillie who, another Scottish servant, and she was very close to him. In those days, she was just 42. Now she's 68. She's Empress of India. She's dressed in black and all in widow's clothes, but this gorgeously dressed man is distracting her. And so she is. So the court is just gossiping, and they hate him. So the family hate him. The court hate him. They call them the Black Brigade. They hate the Indians. There's this whole coterie of Indians who all go to holiday with them, and they all have their little bags, and they have their chickens, they have their bags, they have their food, they take up so much space. Karim is given the carriage next to the Queen always, so there's this resentment, like anything Karim wants, he gets, and what we want, we don't get, so there's a lot of resentment. And unfortunately for Karim, even the Indians dislike him because of all the Indian servants, since he's been picked as, top notch. So they're jealous of him. So they bitch about him too. And then they go and complain to, the others. So there's a lot of letters of exchange that go around. In fact, it reaches the Viceroy. So in the British Library are files and files of all these complaints which the Viceroy has to deal with. And when Abdul Karim comes visiting to India, the Queen orders the Viceroy, who really has other things to do. There's an empire sort of crisis at most of the time. She says, you must go and meet the Munshi, and you must meet the Munshi's father. And he writes back, no Viceroy has been summoned to, meet the Munshi's father, but he does it. And then the Munshi's, his wife, the Viceroy, she goes and meets the Munshi's wife. So she goes and sees the Parda ladies, as they are called. Very excited. But it's the first time that any such thing is happening.
Well, you mentioned the relationship with the family. Edward, of course, hated John Brown as heir apparent, and he hated Abdul Karim. But there were the daughters also, loathed him, Beatrice and Louise. But you also, if you could just touch upon very briefly the relationship between the courtiers. For example, there were two who were supportive of him. One was Henry Ponsonby, who introduced him, who was the private secretary to the Queen, and the second was Dr. Reed, who was her physician and, in a sense, her confidant.
Well, Dr. Reed is this Scottish doctor who is very close to the Queen, and he's in anguish most of the time over all the trouble that the Munshi is causing, and the Queen uses him. The Queen's son uses him. Every time she has a complaint, he can't go to his mother because he has to ask permission to meet the Queen, to meet his mother and complain, and he knows he'll be told off. So he actually goes through Queen Victoria, goes through the doctor. So he goes to the doctor goes to him. It's a triangle that keeps on, sort of furiously building. And he is very tolerant, he's tolerant of the Munshi, but he says this is all Munshi mania. He describes it as Munshi mania. And Ponsonby is the same. But, for the Indians, they used to just call them the Black Brigade. And they say the Black, they were racist down to the T. So they would say the Black Brigade is taking over, this, that,
Dr. Reed was Queen Victoria's physician, and he then served her until her death, as we'll come in a few moments. We'll talk about it. But what is interesting is that Queen Victoria had so much confidence and attachment to the Munshi and his family, because the wife is then brought to England, and the mother-in-law, that...
he was a good Indian. He wanted the whole family.
The whole family. And then when, obviously, the wife fell ill, they had no children, so there is a situation where Queen Victoria is almost advising Munshi on how he should father a child. And, am I right?
Yes,
then
absolutely.
it goes to a stage where Dr. Reed is required to attend to the wife. And he records in his diary, that the only thing I could see was a hand being put out. And sometimes different tongues were brought out, not at the same time. Okay.
Absolutely. So they had to, obviously be behind Parda and then go about this hand. And you talk about what I describe as the, Victorian manual for Abdul Karim. Yes. So it's amazing. All the letters were actually destroyed that Victoria wrote to Abdul Karim, but a few survived. And they are in Windsor Castle, and you read these letters, and you think, this is the Queen. And they are completely frank, and she's almost advising, this, stopping short of positions. She's sort of almost doing everything else. And these are the letters she's writing to her own Munshi about how, he should have children.
And this was one order that he didn't carry out, because he died without any children. The
Victorian manual didn't work.
Just before we came here, we were having coffee together, and Shrabani mentioned to me that she had seen the record Queen Victoria's journals, etc., and told me something which I'd never known before. Queen Victoria, I knew this part, but she had a very restricted upbringing, and she slept with her mother in the same room for the first 18 years of her life. It was only when she became queen that she actually moved out and had her own separate bedroom. So when she married Albert, she was over the moon. And Shrabani mentioned to me that in the journal, Queen Victoria wrote 3 pages about their first night together. 3 pages!
Yes.
And I'm dying to find out what those 3 pages contain. But anyway, that's for your next...
It's a graphic description. The thing is, when I started writing this book, it was about Queen Victoria, and the impression we have of Queen Victoria is this enormous woman, empire, dressed in black. You can see her there, bonnet on her head, and, very dour person, no sense of humor. Her classic line was, "We are not amused." So I was thinking, this is going to be one hell of a book. And actually, what I discovered is that she is very, very passionate. She was a real romantic. Her journals are full of, she just admires, drools over these Indian princes who come, and she's always talking about their turbans and their jewelry, and she loves wearing the Kohinoor. So whenever she's going to meet Indian royalty, or, she was Queen of Bling, she would wear her biggest diamonds, and her Kohinoor, she would write, "I will wear the Kohinoor." And of course, Albert was her first love. She's graphic about it. But she's double standards. As we know, Victorian times, you think of them as being restricted, but not for, for everybody else, yes, but it doesn't apply to the Queen, no.
The Queen?
In fact, I'll show you, I'll move this on. This shows them working together, but I'll show you, let me see. Okay, this is her with more Indian servants, actually. So there she is, and she would always be like this, dressed. This is one of her Jubilee portraits. Those are two Indian servants, Karim, Mustafa and others. And this, now you see this portrait of Abdul Karim, she had this painted, and in this is within a year of his arrival. So he does not look like a servant, right? I mean, no way. He is painted to look like a Nawab almost. This is a clerk from Agra jail. He's holding a book and he's looking sideways. So this is the interpretation she wanted. And this is in Osborne House, one of her palaces. So it's an amazing portrait.
Well, Queen Victoria used to end her letters to Munshi Abdul Karim by signing, "Your dearest friend, your true friend, your affectionate mother." Tell me, with
and
such...
sometimes they had little hearts, the crosses were kisses, yes, hearts and kisses.
Well, obviously, when you're so close to the monarch, there's bound to be an accusation of influence in affairs, and particularly when she used to show him some of the documents that had come out of the red boxes. It was alleged that Queen Victoria shared the contents of these boxes. Was he, as one of the courtiers' father says, was he an irritant or a danger?
Well, he was definitely not a danger. That was way over the top. He was more than just an irritant. He was a source of, he was nightmarish for them, because every time, between the Golden Jubilee and the Diamond Jubilee, this man is getting bigger and bigger. I mean, here's his portrait. Then he's been given these awards. She's given him houses, 3 houses in Windsor, in Frogmore, in Osborne House. She builds a house for him in Balmoral. This is the royal family estates in Scotland. And it's still there. She called it Karim Cottage. Any of you go visiting Balmoral, which is open in the summer, when the Queen is not there, of course, you will see Karim Cottage. It's in the grounds. And, she built this for him. He had a housewarming party, and he gave a speech in English, which was reported in all the newspapers. So he was having a really good time. I mean, he had his private carriage. When his father came visiting, his father was the only one who was allowed to smoke a hookah in Windsor Castle. And the Queen normally hated smoking. She would not allow anyone to smoke, but the father had the rights. And then he was taken on tours all over. Then, of course, he was given medal after medal after medal. He was given the CIE. Yeah.
Shrabani has mentioned that there was an occasion where she repeated what she had done once before, when she went and spent a night alone with John Brown in this secluded little place in Gassault, I think. And 20 years later...
We have the photo in the book, I haven't got it here. But it's
20 years later, she goes with the Munshi, without any attendants, and just the 2 of them go to this little cottage. And I was reminded, and I hope you don't mind me telling the story, but it's a slight deviation. I was in Hyde Park, Speaker's Corner, where Mount Arch is, and there was a West Indian gentleman standing on a soapbox. And he said, "I am Queen Victoria's grandson." So everybody looked aghast at him. You know, in the public, so it's free for all, anybody can say anything they want. They said, no, shut up. "No, I am Queen Victoria's grandson. I am royalty." Someone said, "Go on, what do you mean you're her grandson?" He said, "King of Zululand, visit Queen Victoria on state visit. Invited to spend the night at Windsor. I am Queen Victoria's grandson." There's no grandchild to commemorate that particular thing. But obviously, matching his influence at the court, there was his affluence, and gradually Abdul Karim, being an industrious Muslim, began to acquire land. And could you just quickly describe how...
Well, the Queen knew that he was hated by her family and her courtiers, and she knew that she had to provide for him while she was alive. She was pretty canny that way. So she writes to the Viceroy, one of the thousands of letters that she writes to this poor man, and she says, now Abdul Karim needs land, and he needs some 300 acres of land in prime property in Agra, naturally, nothing less will do. And he's shocked. They have all his responses saying such a thing never happened. He's been there for a year in court. The last Jagir, as they were called, the last Jagir was given to this soldier from the Indian Mutiny who lost his arms and his legs. Basically, has not much of him left, and he was given a Jagir which was 1/4 of this, and this young man has done nothing. So the Queen writes a volume of letters back to him and says, you know, Munshi is this, he is my personal thing, he has done a lot for me, and of course she's the Queen. And whenever she wanted to stress something, she used to write in third person. So sometimes she would write the Queen, but when she's really angry and she really wants something, then it's always the Empress. So then the Empress, you know, the E word will come in. And of course the Viceroy has to give in. After some letters are exchanged, he says, take the land. So Karim has this prime property, acres and acres, and then later he goes and, you know, adds to it. So when I was researching it, I went to Agra. I found his house, and then we drove around, and I said, ye jagah hai, and they were taking me in, we're driving for hours, and I said, ye sab hai. He said, there used to be, you know, little sort of lakes, and there were orchards, and everything, and he owned all of that.
We know how it's done, Shrabani, we know how it's done here. Obviously, with such a proximity to royalty, they were enjoying this very close relationship between the two, but all was not well in the Kingdom of Osborne House. And gradually, the household decided that they wanted to take a stand. And so they got what Marie Mallet, her lady-in-waiting, described as a curious piece of history. An ultimatum was given, to be given to Queen Victoria. Now this is by her entire staff. They rebelled against the Munshi, and they decided that Harriet Phipps, who was the lady of the bedchamber, should be sent to Queen Victoria to tell her that we are not prepared to be treated at par with this brownie. Would you like to read out?
Yeah, sure. Well, this is a chapter that I call Rebellion in the Ranks, because this is when we've been stretched to, you know, this is the breaking point. And it's her Diamond Jubilee here. So 10 years have passed. Abdul Karim by now no longer looks like this. He's much fatter. He's kept up with his Queen. The good life, he has enjoyed the good life. And she always takes him for these holidays. Summer is always spent, naturally, in the south of France. And they go to this place called Simiers. It's near Nice. So the household decide that they're not going to travel. If she's going to take the Munshi, they are not going to go. They decide that Mrs. Phipps will go and tell them that if she goes with the Munshi, they will collectively resign. So Mrs. Phipps, who is an elderly lady who wore lots of bangles, had very fussy hats, jangled up and down, because the Queen would often tell her, your bangles make too much noise. So she is now the one to do the job. So here goes. Phipps gathered her stiffly starched skirts around her, thrust her chin out in a defiant mood, and walked briskly across the courtyard towards the Queen's sitting room. Her heart was racing as she strode out, her bangles rattling even louder as she mounted the flight of steps in the tower and approached the door. She knocked and entered. The Queen was sitting at her desk, looking through a large pile of papers. Almost instinctively, she knew that something was amiss. No sooner had Phipps spoken the words, when the 78-year-old Queen flew into a violent rage, dramatically sweeping off the contents of her desk. Books, pens, papers, memos, boxes, and mementos were crashing to the floor as the Queen threw them down, shattering several glass objects in her fury. Never had Phipps seen her in such a state. She fled the room and tearfully conveyed the scene to the shocked household. They had not expected the Queen to back her Munshi over them. For the incandescent household, the Simier trip was a step too far. The Queen won the argument. The household did not resign. And on 10th March, the royal suite started for Simier. The mood was decidedly grim.
Well, Queen Victoria was a pragmatist, if she was nothing else. And on March the 30th, Reed, the doctor, noted that she had admitted that she'd been foolish by acceding to Karim's constant requests for advancement, and yet tried to shield him. Reed then told the Queen about the comments he'd heard about her and the Munshi outside the palace and about her own family. And how, and remember that this is a doctor telling the Queen Empress, and how he had been questioned as to her sanity. And after particularly stressful days, when the Prince of Wales, the Duke of Coburg, etc., rounded on the Munshi, the doctor wrote, saw the Queen twice about Munshi, I'm sick of it. When the confrontation, then Reed confronts Munshi and the whole thing kind of subsides. But Queen Victoria was Queen Victoria, Queen Empress. And so then she sets off, she releases a salvo. And would you like to just give the orders that she issues to her household?
Well, every time she's challenged, I mean, Queen Victoria is the only one who constantly backs the Munshi. She backs him against her family, against the household, against the Prime Minister, the Viceroy. You know, she wins several brownie points from me, actually. She really takes him on. And she says, so every time that there's a strong memo that goes out, and here she is. This was a, I think, 30-page memo. I won't obviously read the whole thing, but here it goes. Excelsior Hotel Regina, memo from Queen, April 23, 1897. I wish to be assured on the following points, namely, 1. That the gentlemen here should not go on talking about the painful subject, either amongst themselves or with outsiders, and not combine with the household against the person. And she writes AGST dot. So she was the ultimate texter, you know, in short form, always. 2, that while I know that they do not wish to consider him at all as an equal, which I never considered him, they should, SHT dot, treat him with common civility, which good breeding must prompt. So she really sort of gets at them that you have to be civil to the Munshi. And so on and so forth. There's a really long message. He'll be given his carriage, his home. You have to be. She writes to her son, Edward VII, once that you will be courteous to the Munshi. She actually writes that line because he's been rude to him. And then what does she do? She CCs that to the Munshi. So it's like these two against Edward. I mean, sometimes you feel sorry for Edward. This is his mother who treats him like completely ignores him all the time. He has to knock before he enters her room, ask permission to meet her, while the Munshi is sort of standing inside there. And CC'd a message like this, that you will be good. And his reply to that, yes, I will be polite to the Munshi, is obviously, shown to the Munshi too. So,
It was said that it's not royalty that is difficult to manage. It's the courtiers who are intimidating. And this is a prime example of it. Shrabani has mentioned about Queen Victoria's, she's hinted at the word racism, but there was a more overt command by her. And she does this in a letter which I think deserves to be read in extenso. So would you be kind enough to part with the bitterness feeling of it tonight?
Yeah, she sends another memo. There's endless memos being sent to poor Reed, who was a long-suffering, sort of for the Munshi affair. Then she writes, the bitterness feeling and nasty racial feeling, she calls it nasty racial feeling, can only have produced extraordinary behavior and injustice, which led to it last year. This is the last revolt that happened. What could have recently caused this enmity to the poor man, who injured no one, interfered with no one, never put himself forward, and the very few occasions he appeared is credible. So, he can do no wrong, basically. Then she writes, he may have given himself airs or boasted in India, but not more than others. So she's actually explaining, for him. He very most likely was misled into publications and let his name appear without reflection, but that has happened to others. More and more does the plot of Indian and English jealousy show that stories utterly unfounded to have appeared and were told by people out of sheer spite and jealousy behind everything, and a tissue of falsehoods were believed, which must be put a stop to. VRI, Victoria Regina.
He introduced her to Quraysh and he introduced her to Urdu. And something that Shrabani has brought out in her researches and then in her book was the fact that Queen Victoria, under his tutelage, used to maintain a journal in Urdu. Now, diary writing is some habit of the royals. Queen Victoria set it in motion, and then Queen Mary was diligent in writing as George V's wife, and the present Queen does. She writes, and when somebody asked her, do you use the computer? And she said, no, I write by longhand, doesn't everyone? So her diary, so you had access to the 13 journals, the Urdu journals. Would you like to describe those?
Absolutely. In fact, I'll show you one image. Let's get it. Here we are. These are the journals. So they are obviously kept in the Royal Archives. I'm sure some of you can read this. This is actually Queen Victoria's last entry in Urdu. This is 2 months before she died. You can see the date there, November. And she's, Abdul's been away on holiday, so she writes that she's renewing her lessons with Abdul after a short break. And I can't read Urdu, I'm sorry, so I have a translation somewhere. And she says that, she writes about the war. It's a very sad letter. It's a very sad entry. She says who's been killed in the war, because the Boer wars are going on. And it's a short entry, but this is her own handwriting, and this is what they were doing. Now, every day, for 13 years, ever since, everybody's busy reading this. Yeah, well, there we are. They were called QVJ. You can see the catalogue marking. It's Queen Victoria Journals.
For those of you who are not,
Hindustani, Hind. So that's
for those of you who are not familiar with Urdu, I'd better clarify. This is not the description of her first night with Albert or with Munshi Abdul Karim.
So for 13 years, this is the translation for those who can't read Urdu. Sorry. No. Sorry, this is not the translation. Sorry, I've lost it. Never mind. So now, when they start these journals, so I trace these journals from the first one that they started. Now, the way they would do it is he would write a line in Urdu, and then he would write the line in English, what it meant, the translation. Then he would write the Urdu in Roman, so she could read it out. And then, so he was a good teacher in that sense. I mean, he was not trained to be a teacher, but he did it. And then she would follow all these and then read them out to him. And as these journals go, when he writes the English, his English is really poor, so he'll write, I outwent for a walk, things like that, obviously grammatically incorrect. And she will correct it in her translation and say, I went out for a walk today. Every evening, it always starts with, we went for our ride today. The weather was fair, whatever, that sort of stuff. And as the journals go, so by the end, she is writing half a page, no prompting. She's writing this on her own, not translating. And his English has improved. So they're both, helping each other, which I found very moving. Just reading these 13 years, there's so many journals. I read the whole lot, took me ages. But it just showed the progress of their relationship. And these journals, this was their own space, away from family, troublesome courtiers. They were locked in it, and she would never miss a lesson. I mean, she must have been the ideal student, because even when they're traveling on a ship, she has her lesson. When he's ill, she takes her journal and goes to his house, props him up on his pillows, and they still have the lesson. So she never ever, except the time that Abdul Karim is traveling in India, she takes her Urdu lessons for 13 years.
Well, all good things come to an end, and so does the life of Queen Victoria in this relationship. She celebrates her Jubilee, Diamond Jubilee in 1897, and of course this is the cusp of the relationship and Abdul Karim's presence at the court. After that, she begins to fall ill, and gradually she deteriorates. You've seen this, her handwriting began to falter, and then on the 22nd of January 1901, in her beloved home of Osborne on the Isle of Wight, she dies in the bed where, on the side, she had kept a portrait of her husband, Prince Albert. She kept it there for 40 years since his death. And in an alcove, a picture of John Brown and of Munshi Abdul Karim. 3 men in her life.
And it's still there. If you ever visit Osborne, you will see it. They have kept it. They have not moved it. And I asked them, I said, was this always like this? Is this kept as it was in Victoria's days? And they said yes. So she would have these men. And actually, below that, there's a third person, one third Indian.
Oh, God.
And I think that was just there, so it wasn't that obvious.
Not another.
Not another. He was just one of those. But I think his photo was just put in there so that it didn't look that obvious, So he had the 2 favorites on top.
Queen Victoria dies in the arms of Dr. Reed and of her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the son of her eldest daughter, Victoria. And her body is then, Dr. Reed is given responsibility, but there are certain things which he's required to do, which Queen Victoria then had willed in private instructions to him, which he carries out. And those are?
Well, it was a secret will that she didn't trust her family with, so because we know now the relationship with her own family. She wanted John Brown's ring to be on her finger, so she really did love John Brown. She wanted his photograph kept under her, in the coffin. So the doctor, he knows the family won't like that, so he actually hides it under the lilies so that they won't see it. And then the family come and they, the last, before the coffin is closed, they all look around. And then Edward thinks, her son now, he's the king now, Edward VII. And he knows, her last request was also that the Munshi would be a part of her funeral. So he's given, it's a very special honor where only the family come and a very few special people. So he's allowed, he calls him in to see the coffin. to pay his last respects. And as it happens, he is actually, then he closes the door. He allows him to have some time with her alone. It's quite moving, actually. And he actually then becomes the last person to see Queen Victoria before the coffin is closed. So it happened like that, but then the coffin is closed. He pays his last respects, and the men come in and just seal the coffin after that. And she had also requested that the Indians will stand, while she lies in state, the Indians had to stand guard behind her. So they stood for 3 days behind her.
In the bar room at Osborne House.
Yeah. House, yeah.
Well, the aftermath of Queen Victoria's reign after her death was dramatic and instantaneous. Edward VII, now king, first thing he did was to go to around Windsor Castle and then to Buckingham Palace. He picked up every statue that he could find of John Brown and he personally smashed them on the floor. He then sent his wife, Queen Alexandra now, and his youngest sister, Princess Beatrice, who was Queen Victoria's companion, to Frogmore Cottage, which is where Munshi was staying with his wife and his nephew by then, because the mother-in-law had left. And what happened then? Well,
there's this early morning knock, on his door, and when he comes out, the Queen is standing there. She's now Queen Alexandra, the new Queen, and Beatrice, Princess Beatrice, and a whole lot of tough men. And they demand every letter that Queen Victoria has ever written to Abdul Karim. And she used to write about 3 letters a day to him. So he had quite a bit of correspondence. And they demand all these. And the young nephew, he brings them out on a tray. And then they make a big pile outside the cottage and they burn all the letters. So the family just stand there and they are crying and they're watching this. And by then, they keep saying, get everything out. So even Christmas cards, she was a real writer. So the Christmas cards are burned, this VRI. Sometimes she would sign her name in Urdu. We have, in the book, you'll see where she signed in Urdu. And all these are just burnt. And then they just walk off. And then Abdul Karim is told that his services are no longer required. He is deported. And pack his bags, leave. And not just Abdul Karim, all these other Indian servants who you saw some pictures of, they're all sent back. And so no more turbans, no more colour in the court. And one of the viceroys, her wife, Lady Churchill, she writes that suddenly the court had become a very cold place. There was no colour left anymore. And naturally, so there was no smell of curries, Edward. Yeah. No more curries cooking in these kitchens. It was a very cold place suddenly after her death.
Well, that was the first hall. And then the second hall was when he goes back to Agra, and through the viceroy, another man is sent to ask for any letters that they may have, anything at all. So they produce some. And then a third hall is taken place where some of the things after his death, where some of the things that he not surrendered, even those are retrieved. So they did everything possible to try and erase. But the Munshi still managed to retain some level of hold on the royal family, and that when King George V came to the East in 1905 as the Prince of Wales, he actually then meets Munshi and writes back to his father and tells him that I've met Grandmama's Munshi. He dies in Agra, and you found the monument.
He dies 8 years after the Queen, and he was just 40, he wasn't old at all. So he was heartbroken, basically. That's how I see it.
At some stage, he was discovered to have had gonorrhea by Dr. Reed. Okay, and that's not what killed him. But
he did have that. It's a mystery. I haven't solved that mystery, but I think it was on one holiday in India when he went, and he writes in his diary that he went to see some Nautch girls. So we don't know.
Yes.
He dies within 8 years. I think he was just heartbroken. He'd lived a good life. He had houses. He was the Queen's confidant. Suddenly he's back in Agra. He's obviously got a lot of money. He's got a lot of land, but his heart was there. The way he was sent back was heartbreaking. He was sent out like a common criminal, and
he felt it.
Absolutely. So,
well, Shrabani has you mentioned how you researched in the Royal Archives at Windsor and of course at Osborne House, etc., and paintings which were in the what's now the Indian collection at Osborne House. You've also mentioned the private papers of Dr. Reed, and there was, as Shrabani discovered after she had written the first edition of this book had been published, suddenly she discovered that there was yet another journal. But this one was not in Osborne House, was not in England, was not even in India, in Agra. It was in Karachi. Would you like to explain to us?
So what happened is, actually I found Karim's grave. I spent 3 days in Agra, literally searching the graveyards, because I said, this man died there. Now, nobody knows about him. They don't know about him in Agra. Everybody said, we don't know, never heard of him. And I said, he was this rich man, he was Queen Victoria's. I haven't got a picture here, but in the book you will find this is he has a mausoleum, and that's his grave in Agra. So I found that, and then I was still looking for his family. So the hardback was published, and I was doing a lot of media interviews, and I kept saying to all the newspaper journalists, you know, put it out there, I'm looking for the family. He didn't have any descendants, but he had his nephew, and I know the nephew had children, his brother's son, who was almost like his own son, Abdul Rashid. And then I was doing my third talk at the launch of the book, and you know, you're doing the book tours. And in Bangalore, the British High Commission called me, and they said, well, we have Abdul Karim's grandson has called, and he wants to meet you. And I said, oh yeah, sure. Obviously, I just thought, Bangalore of all places, you know. I knew the family was in Pakistan. I knew they'd moved here. And then he said, no, he's insisting he is the grandson. I said, can't be the grandson. So then they said, well, I said, okay, send him along. He can come to one of my talks, and I'll see him. And this evening, this man comes. He comes with a briefcase, and he opens it, and he shows me a whole lot of photographs. And he says, and there were photographs of the Munshi. And so I was saying, okay, something's happening here. And then he said his mother is alive, and she was 87. And then, you know, this was the cherry on the cake. He says, she is Abdul Rashid. Remember the nephew who'd gone? Abdul Rashid's daughter. And she was alive, and she's living in Bangalore. So obviously, then the very next day, I was there, I met her, and you know, I had to clarify the story. And yeah, it was true. She remembered her time in Karim Lodge. She remembered the Munshi's wife, who died much later. And then they told me the rest of the family is in Karachi, and there is a diary there. So I went straight back to London, got my visa, straight back to Pakistan, and went to Karachi, where I got the diary. Met the family, I lived with the family, and it was fantastic, because this was a journal, the royal household, you know, they write about it, that the Munshi is writing something he wants to publish. It must never be published. And so he had actually hidden this. And you know, this thing of this thrill of finding this diary that this, you know, has not been seen by anybody for hundreds of years, for 100 years, sorry. And something they didn't want to publish. And here I'm going to now put it out there and publish it. And I did that. And there's a line in it which he writes that, whosever hand this falls to, I hope it, there's a very sweet line that, you know, I hope they get some idea of my life. And I said, yes, that's me. It fell into my hands.
You know, the case of John Brown and the case of Munshi Abdul Karim are not unique. Most recently, there's the case of Peter Burrell, who was Lady Diana's valet and was accused of appropriating letters and gifts, etc. And there's another person who was called William Tallow, and he was with Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, for 51 years. And he was known as Backstairs Billy. So they were all suspect because they were accused of pilfering items, etc., rather like his nephew was. But Shrabani, you mentioned to me that there is a possible film option on your book, and I'm wondering what the title is going to be. Is it going to be called The Over-Ambitious Munshi or The Reluctant Khidmatgar? So let me thank you for a wonderful book, a wonderful read. Shrabani will be signing copies in the Liberty Bookstall downstairs, but we'd be happy to answer, she'd be happy to answer whichever questions any of you may have. Please.
Time, yeah.